Everything you have been told about learning is fundamentally wrong, and the proof is sitting in your search history right now. You have watched hundreds of productivity videos. You have downloaded apps. You have tried the Pomodoro technique, spaced repetition, active recall, all of it. And yet here you are, 3 hours into a study session, crying in your bedroom because your brain refuses to cooperate. The problem is not your work ethic. The problem is not your intelligence. The problem is that you are trying to learn with an emotional system that evolution designed to keep you alive in a savanna 200,000 years ago, not to pass your medical boards or learn quantum mechanics. Let me be very clear about what is happening inside your skull right now. There is a circuit in your brain actively sabotaging your ability to learn, and it is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is called the limbic system, and it is older than language, older than tools, older than almost everything that makes you human. Its job is simple: detect threats, generate emotions, force you to act. When your ancestors were on the African plains, this system kept them alive. When a lion appeared, there was no time for rational analysis. The limbic system flooded the body with cortisol and adrenaline, shut down the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for logic and planning, and forced immediate action, run or die. That was the equation. Fast forward to today. You sit down to study organic chemistry. Your limbic system does not know the difference between a threatening exam and a threatening predator. It sees the textbook. It remembers the last time you failed a test. It remembers the shame, the disappointment, the fear of not being good enough. Within milliseconds, your amygdala, the alarm system of the brain, fires. Cortisol floods your bloodstream. Your prefrontal cortex, the CEO of your brain, the part that can actually process complex information, starts to shut down. Your heart rate increases. Your palms sweat. Your thoughts scatter. And now you are trying to learn advanced material with a brain that is chemically identical to someone running from a lion. This is not a metaphor. This is not motivational speaking. This is basic neuroscience. Robert Sapolsky, one of the most respected neurobiologists at Stanford, has spent decades documenting how stress toxicity destroys cognitive function. When cortisol levels remain elevated, the hippocampus, your brain's memory formation center, begins to atrophy. The connections between neurons weaken. Your ability to encode new information collapses. You are not lazy. You are not stupid. You are trying to build a skyscraper while the foundation is on fire. Now let me tell you something that will make you deeply uncomfortable. Psychopaths do not have this problem. And before you close this video thinking I am glorifying monsters, stay with me because the science here is going to save your academic career. Psychopathy, clinically defined, involves a significant reduction in limbic system reactivity. The amygdala in psychopaths is smaller, less active, less connected to the prefrontal cortex. What this means in practice is that psychopaths do not experience fear, shame, or anxiety the way you do. When a psychopath sits down to learn something, there is no emotional interference, no cortisol spike, no amygdala hijack, just cold, mechanical information processing. They learn like machines because neurologically, they are missing the exact system that is sabotaging you. I am not suggesting you become a psychopath. What I am suggesting is that you learn to simulate the neurological state that makes their learning so efficient. You need to build a firewall between your limbic system and your prefrontal cortex. You need to learn how to study in a state of emotional neutrality, where the content you are processing is divorced from the meaning your brain wants to assign to it. This is not about motivation. Motivation is an emotion, and emotions are the enemy of deep learning. This is about engineering a mental state where learning happens regardless of how you feel about it. Here's the biological reality you need to accept. Your brain was not designed to learn abstract information. It was designed to learn patterns relevant to survival. How to track animals, how to identify poisonous plants, how to read social hierarchies. When you force it to learn calculus or contract law, you are hacking a system that was built for a completely different purpose. The emotional interference you experience is not a bug. It is a feature. Your brain is trying to protect you from wasting energy on information that, from an evolutionary perspective, has zero survival value. Every time you sit down to study something difficult, your limbic system is screaming at you to stop, to conserve resources, to do something that feels immediately rewarding instead. This is why you can spend 8 hours scrolling through social media, but cannot focus on a textbook for 20 minutes. Social media triggers your dopamine system. It provides immediate and unpredictable rewards. Your brain was designed to chase those rewards because in the ancestral environment, social information was survival information. Knowing who was allied with whom, who was a threat, who was a potential mate. These were life and death questions. But knowing the Krebs cycle or the subjunctive mood in Spanish, your brain does not care. There is no dopamine hit. There is no immediate reward. There is just effort and discomfort, and your limbic system will do everything in its power to make you stop. So how do you override this system? How do you learn like a psychopath when you were born with a fully functional emotional brain? The answer is not willpower. Willpower is a limited resource, and trying to force yourself to study through emotional resistance is like trying to sprint up a mountain while carrying a neat boulder. You will exhaust yourself before you make any real progress. The answer is protocol. You need a systematic method for creating emotional detachment from the learning process itself. Let me pause here for a second and ask you a question that maybe no one has ever asked you. What is the worst part of living with this internal struggle? Not what you tell people, but the part you carry in silence. I want you to know something. What you are feeling is more common than you imagine. Thousands of people are watching this video right now carrying exactly the same weight. If you have the courage, leave a comment telling me what is the hardest part for you. Your honesty might make someone else feel less alone today. Now let me continue showing you how to break this pattern. The first principle of emotionless learning is this: separate the act of learning from the outcome of learning. Your brain assigns emotional weight to studying because it has fused the process with the result. When you open a textbook, you are not just seeing words on a page. You are seeing your future, your identity, your worth as a human being. If you fail this exam, you are a failure. If you do not understand this concept, you are stupid. Your brain has turned learning into an existential threat, and the limbic system responds accordingly. You need to decouple these things at a neurological level. Here is the protocol. When you sit down to study, you're going to implement what I call cognitive reframing through linguistic precision. You are going to stop using language that assigns meaning to the learning process. You are not going to say, "I need to study for my exam." You are going to say, "I am going to process information for 30 minutes." You are not going to say, "I have to understand this chapter." You are going to say, "I am going to expose my brain to this material." Notice the difference. The first set of statements is loaded with emotional freight: need, have to, understand. These words trigger your limbic system because they imply consequences, judgment, success, or failure. The second set of statements is mechanistic: process, expose. These are neutral actions with no emotional weight attached. This might sound trivial, but language shapes neural activation patterns. The words you use to describe a task literally change which parts of your brain light up when you perform that task. If you tell yourself you need to study, your amygdala interprets that as a threat. Need implies lack, which implies danger. But if you tell yourself you are going to process information, your prefrontal cortex interprets that as a neutral task, no different from brushing your teeth or washing dishes. The same action, but a completely different neurological response. The second principle is environmental sterilization. Your study environment is filled with emotional triggers, and every single one of them is sabotaging your ability to learn. That chair where you always procrastinate. That desk where you had a panic attack last semester. That window where you stare when you are avoiding work. These are not just objects. They are conditioned stimuli. Your brain has associated them with failure, with anxiety, with escape behaviors. Every time you try to study in that environment, you are fighting an uphill battle against your own conditioning. Here is what you are going to do. You are going to study in a completely neutral location that you have never used before. A different room. A library you have never been to. A coffee shop in a different part of town. The unfamiliarity is the point. Your limbic system has no emotional associations with this space, which means it has no reason to trigger a stress response. You are creating a clean slate, a place where the only association is the act of information processing itself. Over time, you will condition this new space as a neutral zone, a place where learning happens without emotional interference. But environmental change is not enough. You also need to implement what I call the dissociation protocol. This is where we get into the actual psychopathic element of the strategy. Psychopaths have a neurological gift for dissociation, the ability to separate their actions from their emotions. They can perform tasks that would overwhelm a normal person with guilt or fear because the emotional weight simply does not register. You're going to simulate this state through a technique borrowed from cognitive behavioral therapy and adapted for learning contexts. Here is how it works. When you sit down to study, you are going to externalize the learning process. You are going to imagine that you are not the person learning. You are a scientist observing a subject learning. You are going to narrate your study session in the third person out loud or in writing. The subject is now reading page 47. The subject is noting the definition of mitosis. The subject is struggling with this equation and will revisit it in 10 minutes. This creates psychological distance between you and the task. It removes the emotional investment because you are no longer the protagonist. You are the observer, and observers do not feel shame when the subject struggles. They just take notes and adjust the protocol. This technique is extraordinarily effective because it hacks the way your brain constructs identity. Your sense of self is largely a narrative, a story you tell about who you are and what you are doing. When that narrative is emotionally charged, when you are the hero who must succeed or the failure who cannot understand, your limbic system activates. But when you shift the narrative to third-person observation, you remove yourself from the emotional equation. The task is no longer about you. It is about data collection, and data collection does not trigger fear responses. The third principle is dopamine starvation. This is going to be the hardest part for most of you to accept, but it is non-negotiable. If you want to learn like a psychopath, you need to eliminate all sources of easy dopamine from your life during learning periods. No phone, no music with lyrics, no snacks, no breaks to check social media, no rewards for completing a study block. Nothing. You are creating a dopamine desert, and the reason is simple. Your brain will only engage with difficult cognitive tasks if there is no easier source of dopamine available. If you allow yourself to check your phone every 15 minutes, your brain will prioritize that behavior because it provides a guaranteed dopamine hit with zero effort. But if the only source of stimulation available is the textbook in front of you, your brain will eventually engage with it out of sheer boredom. This is not punishment. This is biological manipulation. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that drives motivation and reward-seeking behavior. When you flood your system with easy dopamine from social media, video games, junk food, you raise your baseline dopamine levels. Your brain adapts by reducing dopamine receptor density, a process called down-regulation. Now you need more and more stimulation just to feel normal, and anything that requires sustained effort, like learning complex material, feels unbearable because it cannot compete with the dopamine hits you have trained your brain to expect. By removing all sources of easy dopamine, you force your brain to reset its reward threshold. After a few days of dopamine starvation, your baseline drops. Suddenly, the mild dopamine release from understanding a difficult concept or solving a problem becomes significant. Your brain starts to find the learning process itself rewarding, not because you are motivated, but because it is the only game in town. This is how psychopaths approach tasks. They do not need motivation. They do not need inspiration. They just do the thing because there is no emotional resistance and no competing stimulus. Now let me address the obvious objection. Is this not just making yourself miserable? Is this not turning learning into a joyless, mechanical process? Yes, exactly. That is the entire point. Joy is an emotion, and emotions interfere with learning. The goal is not to make studying fun. The goal is to make studying neutral, to strip away all the emotional layers that your brain has wrapped around the process so that you can engage with the raw information without interference. Once you have mastered the material, once the neural pathways are built and the information is encoded, you can reintroduce emotional engagement. But during the initial learning phase, emotions are the enemy. There is a reason that elite performers in every domain, from chess grandmasters to Olympic athletes to special forces operators, train themselves to enter states of emotional neutrality. It is not because they are psychopaths. It is because they understand that emotions compromise performance. Fear makes you hesitate. Excitement makes you reckless. Frustration makes you quit. The only way to perform at the highest level is to create psychological distance from the outcome and focus entirely on the process. This is what you are learning to do with your studies. The fourth principle is microsegmentation. Your brain struggles with large abstract tasks because it cannot calculate the effort to reward ratio. Studying for an exam is too vague. Your prefrontal cortex cannot model it, so your limbic system defaults to avoidance. You need to break every learning session down into the smallest possible unit of action. Not, I will study biology for 2 hours, but I will read 3 paragraphs and summarize them in 1 sentence each. Not, I need to understand this chapter, but I will look at this diagram for 60 seconds and identify 2 elements I recognize. The smaller the unit, the lower the activation energy required to start. Your limbic system will not panic over reading 3 paragraphs because the threat level is minimal. Once you start, you can continue. Momentum builds. But if you try to tackle a 2-hour study session head-on, your brain calculates the sustained effort required, compares it to the delayed reward, and shuts you down before you even begin. Psychopaths naturally operate in microsegments because they do not experience the emotional pull to think about long-term consequences. They are present-focused, task-focused, and they do not waste cognitive resources worrying about what comes next. You are going to mimic this by deliberately shrinking your time horizon to the next 5 minutes and nothing beyond. The fifth principle is consequence blindness. This is the most psychopathic element of the entire protocol and also the most liberating. You are going to stop caring about the outcome completely, not in a defeatist way, but in a neurologically strategic way. Your brain assigns emotional weight to studying because it can see the consequences. Fail this test, disappoint your parents, lose your scholarship, ruin your future. That cascade of potential failures is what triggers your amygdala and floods you with cortisol. So you are going to cut the chain. You are going to practice what Stoics called negative visualization, but with a twist. Every time you sit down to study, you are going to explicitly imagine the worst-case scenario. You fail the exam. You lose the opportunity. Your life takes a completely different path. And then you are going to accept it, not in a dramatic, tragic way, but in a mechanical, emotionless way. If it happens, it happens. What you are doing is desensitizing your amygdala to the threat. If you have already accepted the worst possible outcome, then your brain has nothing left to protect you from. The anxiety evaporates because anxiety is future-focused. It is a protective mechanism designed to make you avoid danger. But if you have already walked through the danger in your mind and accepted it, there is no need for protection. Your limbic system stands down. And now you can learn. This is not pessimism. This is not giving up. This is tactical emotional disarmament. Seneca, the Roman Stoic philosopher, used to practice this daily. He called it premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. He would visualize losing everything, his wealth, his status, his life, not to depress himself, but to remove the fear of loss. Once you have accepted that you might lose everything, you are free to act without the paralysis of anxiety. This is the same mental state that allows psychopaths to take enormous risks without hesitation. They are not brave. They just do not process fear the same way you do. You are going to simulate that state by pre-accepting failure. The sixth principle is rhythm over intensity. Your brain is terrible at sustaining high-intensity cognitive effort, but it is extraordinarily good at habit formation. Psychopaths do not rely on motivation because they do not experience motivation the same way you do. Instead, they rely on routine, on mechanistic repetition. You are going to do the same. You are going to study at the exact same time every single day, in the exact same place, using the exact same ritual to begin. The consistency is what matters, not the duration. 20 minutes every day at 6 a.m. in the library is infinitely more effective than 8-hour marathon sessions fueled by panic and caffeine. Why? Because your brain loves predictability. When you create a consistent routine, your basal ganglia, the part of your brain responsible for habit formation, takes over. The behavior becomes automatic. You no longer need to rely on willpower or motivation to start studying because your brain expects it. It is part of the schedule. This is why psychopaths are so effective at long-term manipulation and planning. They do not get distracted by emotions or impulses. They follow the script because the script works. You are going to create a script for learning and follow it without deviation. Now we need to talk about failure because you are going to fail. You are going to have days where the protocol does not work, where your emotions break through, where you cannot focus no matter what you do. And this is where most people collapse. They interpret a single failure as proof that the system does not work, that they are broken, that they should give up. This is emotional thinking. A psychopath would look at the failure, note what went wrong, adjust the protocol, and continue. No guilt, no shame, no existential crisis, just data collection and iteration. You're going to adopt the same mindset. When you fail, and you will, you're going to treat it as a system error, not a personal failing. Your protocol had a flaw. You did not remove enough dopamine sources. Your environment was not neutral enough. You did not segment the task into small enough units. Fix the flaw and try again. Do not waste cognitive resources on self-judgment because self-judgment is an emotional process and emotions are the enemy. Of learning. You are a machine optimizing for a specific output. Machines do not feel bad when they malfunction. They get repaired. Let me give you a concrete example of what this looks like in practice. You wake up at 6 a.m. No phone, no social media, no checking the news. You go to your neutral study location, a specific desk in the library that you have never used before. You sit down. You say out loud, the subject is now beginning a 30-minute information processing session. You open the textbook to the page you marked yesterday. You read one paragraph. You summarize it in one sentence in your notebook. You move to the next paragraph. No music, no snacks, no breaks. Just reading and summarizing. After 30 minutes, you close the book. You say out loud, the subject has completed the session. You leave. You do not reward yourself. You do not celebrate. You just move on to the next task in your day. That is it. That is the entire protocol. And if you do it every single day, without deviation, without emotional investment, without caring whether you feel motivated or not, you will learn more in 6 months than you learned in the previous 6 years. Not because you are smarter, but because you have removed the emotional interference that was sabotaging your cognitive function. This is not easy. In fact, it is one of the hardest things you will ever do because it requires you to override millions of years of evolutionary programming. Your brain is going to resist. It is going to throw every emotional trick in the book at you to make you stop. Fear, shame, boredom, frustration, all of it. And you are going to acknowledge those emotions, note them like a scientist observing data, and continue anyway. Not because you are brave, but because bravery is an emotion, and you are operating outside the emotional framework entirely. If you made it this far, I already know something important about you. You do not just want to survive your own mind, you want to master it. This channel is not about magic promises. It is about real people sharing real tools that work in the real world. If this makes sense to you, subscribe to the channel. Not because I am asking, but because you deserve a place where you can learn to build the version of yourself you always knew was in there. Biology is destiny until you hack it. One final note. This content is for educational and fictional purposes only. The strategies discussed are thought experiments based on neuroscience and psychology research, not clinical advice. If you are struggling with severe anxiety, depression, or other mental health issues, please consult a licensed professional. This video is about optimizing learning, not treating psychological disorders. Use these tools responsibly and always prioritize your mental health above performance.